All right, for our final project where we're doing the small tabletop in a Star Wars theme, we're going to do something a little different because I'm going to use this piece of walnut. However, you'll see this part was cut from a very narrow part of the top of the tree. So you've got a ton of sapwood in there. You've got a ton of the bark. However, in this case, because I am doing a Star Wars table, because this looks so interplanetary-like, and because I'm completely encasing this piece, sides, top, the whole side, both sides and the top in resin, I'm only going to do some basic cleanup of this to get rid of some of the loose pieces and the debris. I'm mostly going to leave this funkiness intact because I'm covering the entire thing in resin and I'm not taking the resin off the top. So essentially all that resin on the top and bottom is going to keep all this bark and everything together, because we do have contact area here, we have contact area all here with the actual wood. It's just you are getting some weakness here where you've got a lot of that soft sapwood and the resin, and the bark. But that's okay, again, because we are leaving a full thick layer of resin to keep everything together. Otherwise, if you were doing a tabletop or a board and you were going to surface this and not have, a thick layer of resin on the top and encasing the entire thing, you would definitely want to get rid of this bark in advance. So because our mold is 36.5, I am going to measure out roughly, I'm going to get rid of the piece at the bottom here, and then I'm going to measure out 36.5 inches. What I'm going to do, just to make sure we get good contact when the resin comes to the edges, I'm going to get rid of a lot of the wood, a lot of these soft wood on the edge of the board here. So what we've done is we've cleaned up the ends of this piece, because when we're going to cover up with resin, we're going to obviously trim off the ends. We don't want to have this wood exposed because this is super soft bark, etc., etc. So we want to make sure that where we're actually going to trim this out and make our final table, that all this soft wood and stuff that you normally would take off is completely covered in resin and is not exposed outside of the resin. We've got our trimmed up, sort of cleaned up piece. We're going to drop that in our mold. Now this mold is HDPE, as we've mentioned in the mold video in this series, which is a little bit different than our silicone molds. They're imperfect, so you're going to need to do some trimming and planing. In this case, we're going to probably plane the bottom, trim the sides, but we're leaving the top because we are going to coat that with some tall resin. One, to encase this wood, as I had mentioned multiple times, because we're leaving the bark and everything on. We want it fully encased in resin, so it's structurally stable. And two, to make sure that our little model is going to, because it's sitting higher than the wood, it's going to need some extra resin in there to compensate for that. All right, so we're going to measure this out and calculate how much resin we need. Now, we're only going to do a small layer of like a starry night gray type colored resin, because we want to get a base layer of probably 1/2 inch first, and then the rest is going to be clear. The rest going up the sides, and the top is going to be completely clear resin. So we're going to do the base layer in total boat Thickset, which again is good for up to 1 inch, and we're going to do the rest of it in total boat Thickset Fathom. All right, let's get started. So this one's going to be pretty hard to measure because it is so very funky. But because we are not filling it up all the way anyway, it doesn't really matter. We're just going to get a general base layer. We've got 4 inches, 5 inches, 3 inches. We're going to say 4 inches, and we have our 36.5 inch mold, so roughly 73 total long by 4. And we want to get like a 1/2 inch pour. So to get roughly 1/2 inch in here, we're gonna need approximately 82 ounces of resin, give or take. Because we are only doing that base layer, it's not that important how accurate we are. We're going to give this a stir. Again, stirring until the resin and hardener are fully mixed and we don't have a murky white fluid anymore, but we have a basically clear fluid. Typically it's 2 to 3 minutes, and in this stuff, because it is a pretty thin material, you could definitely mix it with a power mixing head, but I'm just going to go ahead and do it with my stir stick. Now, because we are leaving all this soft, very porous, somewhat brittle material in place, I'm going to just do a quick over pour of clear resin to get some into some of these crevices. That's going to seal up that wood, so when we actually do our full clear pour, it's not going to be so bubbly, because you're going to have a lot of air coming out. In this case, because we are leaving all that material on, there's a lot of places for air to get stuck and bubbles and stuff to get stuck. So I'm going to do a quick over pour. Now I'm going to take the rest of this and I'm going to put our pigment in, which is going to be a starry kind of galaxy from far, far away themed pigment, like a dark gray black. Kind of a gunmetal color pigment, and we're going to use a fair amount of it. We have a high volume, but we also don't want it to be clear at all. We want a nice dense, voids of space type look to it, right? So you've got this nice gunmetal, kind of a dark gray, almost black look to it. And we're just going to go ahead and pour this along the sides of our wood that we just did a quick clear pour on to seal up some of those edges. And we'll mix the gray and clear with our stick after we've poured it, just so we don't have any clear along the bottom. Should be enough to hold that piece down. And then we're going to torch this really quickly to get rid of those bubbles. All right, it is the next day, and roughly 18 hours have passed since we poured this resin, and it is not set yet. It is a little bit pliable, but it's not tacky either. If you recall in the epoxy video that we did in this series, when you're doing multi-layer pours, you definitely don't want to let it fully set and then pour again. You either want to do it while it's still tacky or not quite set yet. In this case is okay, or if it has been set and it's nice and hard, you want to give that a rough sand with some sandpaper, because you want that next layer of resin to bond. So that's really, really important. Right now we don't have to do it because this isn't fully set yet. It's still relatively pliable. I can push things into it, a fingernail, etc. But what we're going to go ahead and do now is we're going to actually super glue or CA glue our TIE Fighter, as well as I cut some Imperial Galactic Republic logos, basically the bad guys in Star Wars. If you're not a Star Wars fan, I've cut the Galactic Republic logo, sprayed it in red, and put it on a clear coat. I'm going to put that at the opposite side of the table. So I'm going to lay those out now. I'm going to glue them down, and then after they're fully glued and set, we can pour the rest of our resin. So now that our resin is partially set there, we don't need that weight anymore, so I can take that right off. This is not going to float anymore, even if we put our top layer resin on. And the idea is I want to offset these. So I'm going to put the TIE Fighter on this side, and then I'm going to put the little Galactic Republic logo on this side. And if this resin was, you know, less set, I mean, it isn't set as I said, but if it was really tacky, we could probably just get away with pushing these in and letting it set a little bit more. But I don't want to risk these floating up. So I'm going to use some super glue, and I'm going to use the glue on the bottom of the surface of these parts and push it into the resin and let that dry before I pour the resin, because the last thing I want is that next layer of resin making these things float up. Regarding using hot glue, I wouldn't use hot glue, because once I put that next layer of resin on, that, as you know, resin heats up, right? So I've actually tried hot glue in the past with a similar project I did, and the hot glue ended up just getting heated up and detached from the resin, and then the part floated up anyway. So that's why I'm using super glue in this case. So I'm gonna give that about 10 minutes for the super glue to fully cure there. So that's not going to come off, and then we'll go and we'll mix up the rest of our resin. So I've calculated this out, that we're going to need 485 ounces approximately of resin. That's accounting for these larger side rivers, as well as the height of clear resin that we're going to need to come above the wood and fill to the top of the TIE Fighter, and a little bit more than the TIE Fighter. Remember that we are basically making a solid resin table. In this case, we're encasing the wood in that, right? Which is, again, why we can get away with having the bark and stuff still left on. We're encasing the entire thing in solid resin. So for this pour, because it is a larger volume and a larger depth, we're going to use Total Boat's Thickset Fathom product. So this is the product, if you recall from watching our video series, that is good for 2-inch, possibly up to 3-inch pours depending on the volume. So this is going to be perfect for that. My only concern is that 485 ounces works out to like 14.2 liters. I've got a bucket that I can mix. I'm going to do 7 and 7 liters in this bucket total. So 2 different mixes, 2 different pours of the clear material. But I basically I'm down to the barrel of my Thickset Fathom product. So this is going to use all the Thickset Fathom that I have here in the shop. But that's okay, because this is going to turn out awesome, and I know you guys are going to love it. So I'm going to go ahead and start mixing that stuff. We're going to play some music in the background because the mixing part is boring, and we'll pour it in, okay? All right, so I didn't quite get 14 liters in there. I simply ran out, I didn't have enough material, but it's still good, because as long as we cover that TIE Fighter, that's all we really care about, and it's covered. So yeah, I mixed a little less than 14 liters, but still got that entire project finished. I'll have to get some more Total Boat Thickset Fathom. You'll notice there's a lot of bubbles in there from mixing. That's fine. Over the next few hours to up to a day, those are gonna come to the surface, and we can just knock them down with a torch or a heat gun. So we're going to let this set. It's going to take roughly 4 days to set before we can demold it. We'll come back and we'll see what it looks like. Just about to leave for the day, and I wanted to get a quick video of this. You can see all those micro bubbles are completely gone, and we have a near crystal clear finish. We've still got some bubbles coming out from the wood that just wasn't sealed, which is fine. We're going to probably knock those down tomorrow, and if not, we're going to top coat this thing with resin anyway, so it'll be fine. But yeah, you can see all those micro bubbles of that Thickset Fathom product have just come right out. We're back after about 4 or 5 days letting our resin for the Star Wars table build set. And I want to tell you a quick story about this idiot named Sean. Essentially, what happened is we have 3D printers up on our loft, on our second floor here in the shop. And it was really dusty up there, and I was about to print something. So I decided, you know what? I'm gonna blow all the dust off the 3D printers and get all this stuff off the table and the floor. Not a big deal. It's gonna land on the floor here, and I'm gonna clean it up from there. Not thinking that there was a 1-day-old set resin table on my workbench. All right? Can't see it from here, but there is a nice top layer of dust and debris embedded into my otherwise clear Total Boat Thickset Fathom resin. So yeah, I was kind of PO'd about that. However, that's part of the game, right? Nothing's perfect, especially making. This is yet another mistake I have wonderfully made on camera to share with you. But it's fine. The original intent with this table was to not having to level the top side. I really didn't want to run that through the slab leveler or our CNC machine. My plan was to just do a quick sand, finish the, trim the edges, and then top coat the entire thing. I think I'll be able to get a lot of the initial dust and stuff off the top layer of the resin, but there are some heavier particles that have actually seeped into the resin that could be down a quarter of an inch. I'm not going to take that much off of it. It is what it is. Whatever, it's going to look cool anyway. If you've got fresh resin, put some sort of dome or plastic or something over it, especially if you're going to be still working in your shop, or if you're on your second level blowing off dust everywhere. That would be a great thing to do. Either way, we're going to get started now. I'm going to take this out of the demold. And remember, this is one of our HDPE molds, not our silicone molds. So we're just going to go ahead and loosen up the edges here with a mallet. You don't have to beat the snot out of it. They are fairly thin. It's a fairly thin plastic design. So you just want to flex them enough to get that kind of like cracking noise, not an actual crack, but the disconnection between the resin and the mold. So we're going to go ahead and flip this bad boy over. And it's a lot, it weighs a bit because it's quite a bit of resin. All right. So, there we go. That's a thick piece of resin and wood. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to trim this up. So the easiest way to start trimming this, because it was in that mold, and those molds are imperfect, you've got kind of a small curvature on the edges. We're just gonna choose one point of reference, one side, and it is, I think it's 18.5, that mold. Yeah, 18.5. So we're gonna take off roughly 3/4 inch. So we're gonna go and set our saw blade at 17.75 to the edge of the blade to take off roughly that 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch there. And we'll take a little bit less, quite a bit less off on the other side now that we have a perfectly flat side to work with. I'm going to move the fence, our guide, to the other side. And basically what we're doing here is we just want to cut off enough on both of the sides to get rid of that bevel at the bottom and make it straight. So we could take off 1/4 inch, at most 1/2 inch. And we're going to use the longer side of the table to support the weight of the table instead of using this side where we have the force and the weight of the table going this way. We'll use the longer side, it'll stabilize that piece more. And of course, this is a small table we're doing with the table saw. I have a track saw that goes together too. So if you were doing a larger piece that you couldn't just run through a table easily, this is part of a track saw. There's another section that makes it even longer. And then there is, we did talk about it in our tools video, but essentially it's a circular saw that sits on this track that allows you to do really long, precise cuts, and then just bolts or clamps to the side of your piece. So it'll hold, this track gets held down and you can do it. So I could definitely have used that on this piece, but it's small enough to just use the table saw, which is why I'm using the table saw. All right, so we've trimmed the entire perimeter of this. You can see that we've trimmed enough to expose the wood edge here, but not the loose bark. Remember when we started this table, we took all the bark off the edges, the very fine edges, just so we would not expose any of that bark once we trimmed it. And that is obviously what happened. We were successful in that. So we've got 35 and just over 5/8, 35 and just over 5/8. And we got 17 and just over 3/8, 17 and just over 3/8. So we have a really square table coming out of that mold, and just having to trim it like that. Yeah, 39.75 on the diagonal both times. Okay, sanded to 120 grit. I'm just gonna wipe the excess dust off of this to get ready for the flood coat. We don't want to flood coat this while it's damp, while it's wet. So we are gonna let that dry, but what we're gonna do first is our quick time-saving trick, and rather time-saving for doing the final finishing of this once the flood coat is dry, and that is taking tape and going around the perimeter of the bottom, because what's going to happen when we flood coat is, of course, you're going to have a lot of drips and marks, drip marks rather, coming down the sides from the resin going over the sides. So putting tape on the bottom here is going to make our job a heck of a lot easier when it comes to taking those drip marks off after the flood coat is set. I do cover that in one of our videos in the Epoxy Resin Wood Basics series here on YouTube, but you're just going to see me do it really quickly. This isn't going to prevent sanding altogether, sanding the bottom pieces off altogether. You're still going to have to do a little bit of sanding, but it's going to be a heck of a lot quicker than if you didn't do this. And once we finish at the end of this video, once you see me take it off, you'll understand why. give this a quick wipe to dry off some of that water. And then we're going to move this over to the other side of the shop where it's not so dusty and covered with resin particles and sawdust everywhere, and do our flood coat over there. Now we're setting up our area for flood coating. I've put down a piece of plastic because remember, you're going to get a lot of resin falling off your piece, and you want to raise your piece and make sure everything's level. If you have your piece not level, all the resin is going to come to one side and you're going to end up with possibly no resin on one other side. So I'm going to use some Total Boat mixing buckets, which are all the same level. I know my table is level, I know my concrete floor is level. Perfect. We're going to mix up our epoxy, and of course, my favorite epoxy for flood coating is Maker Epoxy by Total Boat. And you can get this at totalboat.com, and you can use our special discount code as well, which will be at the end of this video. Now, to calculate the amount of resin I need, I would normally do length times width times 1/4 inch divided by 1.8 to determine number of ounces. However, in reality, you're not going to need 1/4 inch thick. This stuff, when it sets, it's going to probably be 1/8 of an inch at most once it flattens out. So somewhere between 1/8 and 1/4 in that equation. So I'm going to go ahead and mix up this material, which is a 1:1 ratio. And of course, the Maker Epoxy is very similar to Total Boat's tabletop product. Both of them would work just as well whether you're using Maker Epoxy or the Total Boat tabletop epoxy on this, because it is a tabletop and we are flood coating it. And we're going to go about 50 ounces, 1.5 liters. So I'm going to go 3/4 liter of A and 3/4 liter of B. And once we mix that up, that'll be 1.5 liters. And that will be more than enough to top coat this project. I'm not wearing any PPE right now, but you should be. I'm only not wearing it because I need to talk and explain what I'm doing. But once I mix this up, I'm going to get my PPE on. Nitrile, latex, or whatever gloves are going to be important, especially for flood coating, because you're going to end up using your hands on the resin. So you don't want to do that with your bare hands. A, it's not going to come off very easily, if not at all. And B, it's probably just not good to be in your skin. So put your gloves on. I've reoriented the camera here for the money shot. This is really where it's like the oohs and the ahs come, because you have this really kind of murky, opaque looking block. Once you add that resin and the top coat starts to fill out, it just looks pretty incredible. That TIE fighter there in the resin, which you can't really see right now, is going to become instantly clear. So we've mixed this up to the point where it's pretty consistent. We do have a lot of bubbles in there from mixing. But again, with this Maker Epoxy stuff, just like the Total Boat tabletop product, because we're pouring it so thin, those bubbles will either leave themselves, or we'll use a heat gun or a torch just to get them out before we consider this project done. I'm just going to lay down the resin, and you can just see it changes the entire top there. It's really the cool thing about flood coating. It's like a cheater way to get like a polished finish without actually having to go through the immense amount of work of polishing resin. I'm going to leave some resin in the bucket just so we can reserve that. And then we're going to work it in with our hands. Remember that this product is self-leveling, so it doesn't really matter. We just want to make sure we get good coverage everywhere. And the other thing is we want to make sure we go and physically work that resin in around the sides, the perimeter, and touch every part. Otherwise you could end up with this, surface tension issue where some of that resin goes over the edge but misses a complete section of it if you haven't physically worked it in there and broken any surface tension. So you want to definitely work it in with your hands and make sure you've covered all your bases, all your surfaces essentially. I certainly would have liked to skip the whole slab leveling and the whole slab leveling process, but my impatience and my lack of paying attention here in the shop when I was blowing off all that material onto the floor led us to go with some other plans here. But either way, it took me a couple extra hours than I wanted to put into it to get to this point, but now it looks amazing, and that's all that really matters. So we're gonna let that go, take the gloves off, we'll let it kind of level itself out, and we'll come back quickly and we'll hit it with the heat gun or torch just to get all the extra bubbles out and get that resin moving. When you use a torch, just do it really quickly. Don't let it sit on the resin for too long in any one place. Otherwise, you'll end up burning the resin. So the heat gun is definitely a safe way to do this. Only use a torch if you have the self-control to be able to wave it quickly. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and let this sit here. I'm gonna keep an eye on it off camera for the next hour or so just to make sure that we've got good coverage and that we don't have any spots opening up where I need to add some extra resin. I may need to, but otherwise that's it. We're really just, it's a waiting game at this point to let this resin set. In 12 to 24 hours, we'll be ready to handle it and put our legs in this table. Also, if you wanna save your time later sanding, typically you do this after about half an hour, so while that resin's dripped down, but just go over with your stir stick and just get rid of all those drip marks. You're still gonna have drip marks in the end, but less is better. Less work is always better. We're back on Monday morning. This has been setting over the weekend, and this flood coat turned out perfectly. It is literally flawless, other than a couple little divots down here where some air holes were. But what we're gonna do now is finish this up by flipping it over and taking off the drip marks along the sides, which is why we did the tape preparation in advance. And you're gonna see just why we did that and how it's gonna save you time. So let's get our blanket set up. We'll flip this over and we'll go from there. So you flip this over onto a furniture blanket. The key is, you wanna use something soft, not something dirty, full of sawdust, because you have your flood coat, so you want something that's gonna be gentle on it. If you get something like a stone or some material down there and it's gonna end up scratching it, it's gonna be a disaster and you don't want that. So all we're gonna get now is our heat gun. We'll get it set to heat. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna put our PPE on because we're gonna be heating up the resin, and then we'll take off the tape, and all these drip marks will come off as well. So we've pretty much gotten all those drip marks off that had fallen down from the flood coat. We got a little bit of a rough edge still, which is expected, but I'm telling you, doing that tape method and heating up that tape and removing those drips that way is gonna be way less work than sanding them from scratch. So I'm just gonna get my sander and 120 grit sandpaper, and we'll just quickly go over the perimeter and take off any other spare pieces that we might have missed or any sort of sharp edges. That's it. So the very last thing we're going to do is install a couple of table legs. I've got some legs from the Live Edge Timber Co., which is just liveedgetimber.com. They're a company in Quebec, Canada, and they actually laser cut and weld these legs automatically. So these are not made in China, they are made in Canada, and you can feel it. They are much heavier duty than the typical Amazon legs. Now, the hardware that most legs come with are bolts like this or screws. I usually do not like to use those. strictly because, you know, if you're building this for yourself, it probably doesn't matter. However, if you're attaching legs in your shop and you're about to ship this somewhere, you're going to remove the legs, and maybe you're going to move one day, and or that your customer's going to move one day, they're going to remove the legs. So what happens when you use these bolts or screws is eventually the pocket that you've drilled in there and everything just loses its grabbing ability. It wears down. It doesn't necessarily wear the screw down, but it'll wear down the actual pocket that you've drilled in, which is why generally I use the Rampatech threaded screw system. So these guys are out of Germany, and what you're basically looking at is a threaded screw that goes into your piece, and then a hex bolt with like a machine screw on it, and essentially that's what holds down your leg. The advantage using these is that this always stays, this receiver part always stays in your wood or your resin or whatever. It's never going to come out, so it's never going to get stripped. It's never going to lose its grabbing ability. It's really just this screw that comes out of there, right? So it makes taking the legs on and off much easier. You could take them off 50 times and still have no problem. Not the same thing is going to happen when you use bolts or screws. However, there's a problem with using this system this way with this particular table, because I have clear resin, right? I've got about ½ an inch of gray resin at the bottom, if you remember when we did the start of this table. So that's completely opaque. But everything after that is clear. So it's clear from here down, right? So if I use something like this system, I could use it in the wood, but if I where the leg lines up with the resin, if I use this, you're gonna see this in the resin. So unfortunately, because of that, really the only place I could reasonably use these and not having to see them is in the actual solid wood itself. So I'm going to go ahead and do that just to demonstrate how this system is used. But I'm going to generally attach most of the rest of the legs, the other part of the legs, with some shorter screws. You really want to get screws that are going to fit within the height of that first layer of resin, because we don't really want those screws popping all the way through and seeing them in the clear resin. I don't think it'll ruin the project, but it just won't look as nice, right? So we're going to go ahead and demonstrate how to drill the holes for the Rampa system, how to fix them, and then we're just going to use plain old screws for the rest of the pieces that go into the resin. That's going to be too shallow to use this system on. Okay, so the first thing you want to do, regardless of what fasteners you're using, is to line up your legs, make sure they're the same on both sides, and pre-mark your holes so you can pre-drill them. I know these legs are 15 inches across. You've got 17.5, so you've got 2.5 divided by 2, so 1.25. So you're going to space these guys out 1.25 in this case. Pre-mark our holes. We'll do the same on the other side. For the sake of demonstrating the Rampatech system, I am going to use these in these guys over here because they are in the wood. Keeping in mind that if this was a regular epoxy table and it wasn't clear epoxy, you used, say, a mica pigment in your epoxy, you could use these all the way around, because no matter what, you're not going to see through the resin, ideally, if it's opaque enough, and you won't be able to see the screws. So in the parts that are actually going into the resin, I'm going to use these shorter screws, which roughly work out to the depth of the gray epoxy and the thickness of the foot on the tabletop. So we're just going to go ahead, we've already marked these out, we're going to pre-drill our holes using a bit that's smaller than the screws, of course, that we're going to be putting in. We don't need to go down too far in the case of these guys. Obviously, this is something you want to really pay attention to, because you don't want to go all the way through the top of your table or the piece of your wood, right? So just make, and you can use a collar on these. It's a little metal adapter that screws on to actually limit how far you can go down with your drill bit. So I'm going to use the Rampa system strictly for demonstration in these holes, because this is our wood. I'm not going to use them here. Obviously, there's no actual real case to do this. It doesn't make sense to mix fittings on a table. You either want to use all of these or for all of your bolts or all of your screws. I'm only doing that for demonstration, just to show you the differences and the advantages to using this, if you can, of course, on your table. So you're going to want to get your bit that's slightly less than the diameter of this Rampa thread. If you don't want to use a collar to limit your drill bit length, you can just use a piece of tape and just make sure you only drill past that, or up to that rather. Next thing I'm going to do is get my countersink bit, because these Rampa receivers have a little bit of flange on them there, so they just typically work well with countersinking. A 6mm Allen key and wrench, which will match the 6mm fitting on this threaded adapter, and then you're just going to put it in, turn it by hand. Now some people will go ahead and get super glue or epoxy and put it on the thread in advance. I'm not sure if it's actually needed. And a little bit of raised wood here will sand that off. So you'll see now the ability to quickly and easily attach those legs with your Rampa screws, assuming that they're the right length, right? And that's it. And that's it. So all you're going to do is tighten these things. These ones are probably a little long for this particular table, so I'm not going to go ahead and put them all the way down. They do come in different lengths, obviously, but generally that's how the system works, and you can see the obvious advantage. You get your Allen key. It's almost like an IKEA system. You get your Allen key, take it in and out, and you can take the legs on and off. So after that quick demonstration on how those Rampa threaded inserts and hex bolts work, we're going to go ahead and just attach the rest of our legs using regular old screws, which I hate doing, but we have clear epoxy. I don't really have a lot of choice. We've already pre-drilled our holes here, so we should just be able to grab our drill and those screws this guy over, and here is our completed table with legs. Hope you enjoyed following along with this video. I had a lot of fun making this particular project. Obviously a big Star Wars fan. If you want to make your own Star Wars themed table and use these little models, they're actually not micro machines. They kind of look like micro machines. If you're a kid of the 90s, then you probably know what those are. They are actually made by a company called Fantasy Flight Games, and pretty much everyone I know that uses epoxy resin or urethane resin for wood turning or making tables and using these types of Star Wars models are from the same company. What do you think, buddy?
No.
Is it good?
Look.
Yeah. Is there stuffing in there?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Oh, is there a model in there?